welcome in everyone to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We have a great show for you today. It is May 16th. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee, and we're going to start talking a little bit more about the House versus NCAA case. It sounds like we're starting to get a little bit closer to a settlement, but there's still a lot of ways to go. So I want to break down where they are right now, what kind of the implications are, and what the official price tag is going to be for the NCAA back paying some of the NIL payments they need to. And then we'll get into one of the consequences of this case, which could be lower roster size, which means no walk-ons in the future, which I definitely want to break down for you all. Definitely something that a lot of college football fans love about the sport, so definitely don't want to see that go, but it might be necessary for the future of the sport. But we'll break down NC State and Virginia. They set up a non-conference home and home. Kind of want to get into what the implications of that and why I don't love that decision just overall for the future of college football. Then we'll get into the transfer portal a little bit more. Still some guys out there that have yet to make their decisions and some guys that have finally made their decisions and found where they're going to play, including Cormani McClain. So I want to break down all of that for you guys. And then we'll get into a hot take Thursday, and it's all about the running backs today. Want to break down why I think 2024 is going to be a huge year for the guys in the backfield. But before we jump into everything, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to have a little bit of a fun interactive experience here, maybe call me out for something I didn't bring up or ask a question that you're wondering about. Again, that's gsmcpodcast.net. But let's jump right in. The House versus NCAA case has been something we've been watching for quite some time. It's definitely going to be a very, very impactful thing in college football, and it feels like it's starting to roll down the road. Now, the House versus NCAA, if you're not aware, is an NIL back pay case, which essentially is just a couple of players, or a bunch of players to be fair, about 7,000 players from the past in college sports, suing the NCAA for essentially what they would have made in NIL money. And that number we'll get to a little bit later in kind of the details of it. It sounds like it's going to be about $2.776 billion from the NCAA's part. That will pull some from school distribution, some from just the NCAA having to pay that check. So we'll get into all that as this kind of goes on. But this resolves a ton of different cases for the NCAA if they can get this settled. Obviously, it settles this one, but also Hubbard versus the NCAA, Carter versus the NCAA. Both of these are very big NIL cases right now, and the NCAA is trying their hardest to get this off of their plate, and it's definitely something that they're trying to expedite. Now, the settlement is having to agree on a couple of really, really big things. We talked about the billions of dollars in back damages to the former athletes for NIL payments, also a new compensation model permitting schools to share up to $22 million a year with their athletes, so that's that revenue sharing that we've talked about a little bit on the show, and then annually, or this would be an annually capped system with athletes, so this is a very interesting thing where you can go to 22, but you can also go below that if you need to, which I'm sure a lot of these schools will need to, which we'll get into as this kind of rolls on. And also an overhaul of the NCAA scholarship and roster structure, which is something we'll get into in the next segment more, but kind of just want to break down what this all means for the schools in particular. So that number is $2.7 billion, as we talked about, and that needs to come from somewhere, right? And a lot of it is going to come from that distribution that has gone out to a bunch of the teams over the last couple of years. That number is roughly around $700 million that the NCAA sends out every single year to these schools. Well, that's going to be cut by about a fifth, by about $160 million a year. That will be cut, and it will be kind of distributed between the teams. The power leagues apparently are expecting to lose about $1 to $2 million a year. So not the biggest hit necessarily on the big boys up top. Definitely will be a bigger hit for the smaller schools that don't necessarily have as much, $2 million to spare as the Texas and the Georgias and the Alabamas of the world. So this will be really, really interesting. 60% of that, that will take care of about 60% of this payment because it's a 10-year deal to make these payments about $277 million annually. So about 60% of that will come from the schools, and then the NCAA has to cover the other 40%. And that is a huge chunk of change for the NCAA, and definitely does not necessarily help them when you talk about the future of college football in particular, and college sports overall, and them being able to keep this power dynamic that they currently have. Well, that might be hurt a little bit if you have to pay this money over the next couple of years, but the alternative is much worse for them. So we've talked about this a little bit, but they need to settle this case, and they need to do it as quickly as possible, and this might be the deal that is as advantageous for them as it can be, because if this thing goes to trial, we've talked about, that number being even quadrupled up to, there have been reports that they could be on the hook for $20 billion. So the amounts that would be, that would skyrocket over the time that you are in a courtroom trying to figure all this out would be insane. It would totally turn this entire sport on its head, the entire athletic structure in college football on its head if the NCAA had to pay that, because a lot of it's coming from the colleges, as we just talked about with this current setup. So a big time element of this is obviously you want to make sure that there's new rules of compensation in place. That being said, with this settlement in particular, because that is going to take some time to set up, they have reaffirmed the current set of rules that the NCAA has had. So kind of a very interesting thing where it's hard to really tell what the rules are, right? What the rules and regulations are, but there are some around compensation, NIL, and that type of thing. But they decided to reaffirm those, but also push them to create new rules around compensation. One of the big ones has been what happens to collectives in this grand scheme, because as we all know, I think NIL has become something that it probably wasn't supposed to be, right? I think we can all agree that there definitely should have been more rules around it, because now you have NIL collectives that are essentially just funneling money from boosters to kids without necessarily having to do anything for it, not doing, the community service, the different monikers that were supposed to be passed to get this money are not necessarily being abided by. So that's something that has been a big question mark. A lot of people want to bring them into the university. A lot of people say that's not possible because of antitrust laws and things of that nature. Well, they're going to try to make that happen. It sounds like with this settlement, there will be economic incentives to bring the collective inside the university, and also a prohibition on any booster payments that are not true NIL. Now, how does that work in terms of actually enforcing those rules? I'm very uncertain. I think it's very likely that we say that on the surface, and then the same type of thing starts happening until we get a real structure in place for what athletes are going to look like in the future. They did leave the idea open that they could be athletes in the or not athletes, of course they're athletes. They could be employees in the future of the university or of the conference. I've said many times on here, I think that's probably the best way forward if we're just trying to make this as crystalline and as good of a structure as possible. Collective bargaining for athletes is something that we've talked about a lot, and it's something that's probably going to be vital for the future of the sport, not only from a standpoint of making sure that all of this is understood and normal, but also just making sure that the people that are affected the most, the athletes on the field, are the ones that are, having these conversations about compensation, about transfer portal, about roster construction, about all of this stuff that impacts them way more than it impacts anyone else. So I think that's going to be a big part of this. I've heard there's been a little bit of pushback from the NCAA with the collective bargaining, but when you look at what needs to be done, I think there's really no way around it. I guess the best way to put it. You're going to have a players association at some point, and if you don't, it could become a big time problem down the road. And I think there's going to be a tons of questions, as we go on throughout this. Obviously, is the 21 million or 22 million that the schools can distribute, how far down the line does that go? I know that Ohio State can do it. I know that Georgia can do it. I know that Texas can do it. But can, Vandy do it? Can Georgia Tech do it? Can these smaller schools that are still Power 5 schools and still big programs, can they afford to give up that amount of money? Because when you talk about what the next 10 years will look like, it's about $300 million that you're adding to your books over the next decade. And that's, 22 or 21 million per year through the revenue sharing. That's 2 million being withheld from you from the NCAA distribution on the back payment damages. And then you have $10 million that likely will go towards additional scholarships and things of that nature to other sports other than college football. So it's going to be fascinating to watch all of this and how the tightrope walk that is going to be keeping all of these budgets in place is going to happen, because there's a lot of places that have a ton of wiggle room. There's way more places that have essentially none. And then the big kind of question mark with all of this is, if you settle this one, it handles, those three cases we talked about at the very beginning, where you handle the House, you handle Hubbard versus NCAA, you handle a ton of different cases, including Carter versus NCAA. But what you don't handle is future cases. And I think it's a little naive of the NCAA to think if they're going to get this off the table, then no one else is going to come to the table with new problems, with new issues about this new setup. It's going to happen. I don't think there's a reality where they're going to be able to implement all of this stuff and do all of this stuff, and especially pay the back payments, admit that, the NIL rules that they had in place before were not correct or not the way that it should have been done, and not expect more people to come ask for their money. So it's going to be fascinating to watch all of this. I think this is, the tip of the iceberg for the NCAA, to be totally honest with you. But you need to get this off the books. You need to make sure that you don't have to fight these 3 or 4 or 5 antitrust cases that they have out there right now. But it doesn't mean that those are going to stop altogether. It doesn't mean that those are going away or that other people won't come forward, right? But in the next segment, I do want to get into what is going to be a very impactful change that could be happening. It sounds like scholarship limitations are going to be in place, as well as roster limitations. And that introduces a very, very interesting thing for college sports, and especially college football, where walk-ons likely are not a thing. So I want to break down what that kind of means and how I don't necessarily love that for the future of college football right after this. So stick with us.